An American Airlines MD-83 carrying 78 passengers and crew is approaching Bradley International Airport in Connecticut for the last time on November 12, 1995. The staff is eager to go to the airport even though it is getting late. The two pilots are fighting to keep the plane on course while the area is covered in turbulence and pouring rain. The control tower was evacuated due to extremely severe winds, and it is currently manned by a lone supervisor who hasn't been on a tower in years. The pilots fight intense turbulence as they try to see the runway through the rain. They would now find themselves falling below their minimum descent altitude, a tiny mistake they made only minutes before coming back to punish them. This is one of those infrequent instances where almost anything that might go wrong did. The tale of American 1572 is unquestionably one of the most bizarre and startling episodes in American aviation history, and it produced some significant concepts for reform throughout the sector. At Chicago's O'Hare Airport, 73 people boarded American Airlines Flight 1572 on November 12, 1995. The 2-hour flight was headed for Hartford, Connecticut's Bradley International Airport. With strong winds, thunderstorms, and torrential rain pelting most of the eastern United States, it was a dreadful night to be in the air. There were numerous flight cancellations and delays as a result of the weather. Chicago was scheduled to receive Flight 1572 at 9:25 a.m. Nevertheless, the flight was delayed by about 2 hours due to the weather. Flight 1572 finally backed out of the gate at approximately 10:45 that evening, carrying 73 passengers and 5 staff members as they made their way to Connecticut. They had no idea that in less than 2 hours, as the captain tried his hardest to salvage the plane, their lives would be in jeopardy. Kenneth Lee, who was 39 years old, was the flight's captain. With nearly 4,000 of those hours spent on the MD-80, Lee possessed 8,000 hours of flying expertise. Before beginning his career with American Airlines in 1986, he had flown for the United States Air Force. John Richards, the first officer, had just over 5,000 hours and was 38 years old of flight experience behind him, of which about 2,000 were on the MD-80. Like the captain, he had flown for the U.S. Air Force for several years before being hired by American in 1989. This portion of the trip would be the crew's second and last flight of the day, with the captain operating the aircraft. The 8-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-83, a dependable short to medium-haul aircraft that rivaled the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737, was the aircraft utilized for this journey. In the 1990s, American Airlines operated more than 300 MD-80 aircraft, making it the largest MD-80 operator in the world. The jet has one of the best safety records of any passenger aircraft and served as the mainstay of American domestic fleet. The jet took off at 11:05 and ascended into the choppy skies above Chicago. The plane was approaching its cruise altitude of 33,000 feet when the pilots got a communication from American Airlines dispatch 15 minutes later. They received the weather report from Bradley from it, which indicated high blowing winds and quickly dropping air pressure. For pilots, knowing the atmospheric pressure is crucial information. Their altimeter, which indicates their elevation above sea level, calculates the plane's altitude based on external air pressure. The outer air pressure decreases as the plane ascends higher. Stated differently, the altimeter's estimate of the aircraft's altitude increases with decreasing external air pressure. This implies that the altimeter will perceive the aircraft as being higher than it actually is when the atmosphere's pressure is low, as it was this evening. In order to justify this pilot, get the most recent information on air pressure and the twisting knob in the cockpit from air traffic control. This allows you to calibrate the altimeter to match the outside air pressure. Shortly after obtaining this meteorological data, the pilots arrived at their usual cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. During the voyage, the flight proceeded largely normally, with the captain once having to ascend to a height of 35,000 feet in order to avoid a region of turbulence. midnight, an hour later, the plane started descending toward Bradley. The pilot then spoke to the passengers, warning them to take their seats and prepare for turbulence all the way down to landing. Right now. For the pilots, this would mean a heavy task. At Bradley, they would be landing on runway 15, which lacked an instrument landing system. This required them to fly a more traditional approach, referred to as a view or approach. This required them to make intensive use of their charts, compass, altimeter, and distance measuring equipment, as they'd have to make sure that they were at certain altitudes at particular distances from the airport. They would have to do this while flying at night in the clouds and in some of the worst turbulence that an aircraft can encounter. At one point during the descent, the captain said to the first officer, "I'll tell you, flying at night, I don't like it worth it." The weather was fast changing, and at 12:30 the captain received the following message from the American Airlines dispatcher. "Captain Lee, pay attention. Obtain data from Bradley Tower. The airplane has begun landing, but they have warned it of low-level wind shear and turbulence on Finale. If it comes to that, the winds at Boston are better suited to the runway." Turbulence was hurling the aircraft around. Considering the intensity of the winds, a trip to Boston was starting to look very likely. A new atmospheric pressure of 29.42 inches of mercury was also reported in the weather bulletin from American Airlines. The air pressure unit is inches of mercury. It comes from the fact that when you put mercury inside a glass tube, it rises and falls along with the air pressure. The standard atmospheric pressure is 29.92 in of mercury. Anything lower than that is considered low pressure, and anything higher is considered high pressure. By calibrating their altimeters to 29.42 during the descent, the pilots could tell the aircraft's actual altitude above sea level. At American Airlines, pilots were required to set their standby altimeter to the actual air pressure at the time. In this instance, 29.42 prompted it to show their altitude above sea level. They also set their main altimeters to an artificial pressure setting during the approach, which is modified to account for the airport's elevation above sea level. As wide as this flight, the airport was located 174 feet above sea level. Because there would be a 174-foot discrepancy between the two altimeters, the pilots would set their primary altimeters to 29.23. This implied that there might not be when they landed too hard. Instead of 174 emitters, there would be 0 feet. This system had the benefit of standardizing all approaches. No matter what airport a crew was flying into, their altimeters would always show similar readings during the approach, and they would always read 0 on touchdown. If you're wondering why I'm going into all this technical detail about altitude and air pressure, you'll see shortly why it mattered so much on this night. Shortly after receiving this weather update from American Airlines and still ascending, the first officer tuned in to Bradley's Automatic Terminal Information Service, or ATIS, and listened to the weather information at the airport. It said that the pressure at Bradley was 2950, that both runways were wet, and that there was severe turbulence below 10,000 ft. The word severe in this context is not used lightly. The 4 categories of turbulence encountered in aviation, light, moderate, severe, and extreme, actually have strict definitions. Even if you may believe that you have experienced severe turbulence previously, it was most likely only mild or moderate turbulence. The forces acting on the airplane are so great that anyone not belted in is catapulted to the ceiling, and the pilots momentarily lose control of the craft. For the pilots, this would be an extremely difficult approach, and for the passengers, nerve-wracking. The captain noticed that the information on the 8th was an hour and a half old when the first officer briefed him on the weather he was hearing. The earlier analysis they had gotten from the dispatcher was actually more up to date. With the atmospheric pressure falling rapidly, it would be important for the pilots to receive more up-to-date information as they near the airport. Wanting to ensure that his colleagues spotted any mistakes during this high workload approach, the captain said, "Just watch me the whole way. All right?" "Yeah, man, you got it. Any comments? Scream out. You're going to get a lot of turbulence. You know how to land it." As it would turn out, this warning from the captain was well advised. Shortly after this, air traffic control instructed the flight to descend to 11,000 ft, and the controller informed the pilots of an updated pressure setting of 29.40 in of mercury. This comes from a weather observation that was made at 11:30, which is already more than an hour old. Still, compared to the other reports the pilots had received by now, it was more recent. The real air pressure had decreased significantly and continued to do so. As a matter of fact, the aircraft's altimeters indicated that it was currently over 50 feet lower than that. This was a minor difference, but it would prove to be fatal when they made their way down to the airport under heavy rain and foggy conditions. A little while later, as the flight crew continued their descent approaching 11,000 feet, They were going over the pre-landing checklist when the first officer shouted out the altimeters. The captain responded with 2950, which was the prior pressure setting identified by him as being 90 minutes out of date. The first officer attempted to correct him, saying they called 2947 when we started down. "Whatever you want," the captain replied. "Okay." While the first officer was correct that the captain had mentioned an outdated altimeter setting. For some reason, he had misremembered the new altimeter setting that air traffic control had provided him during the descent. The controller had said it was 2940, but the first officer had remembered this as 2947. This figure of 2947, when fed into the altimeter, made it display an altitude which is about 40th higher than the correct setting would read. However, even though the first officer put his misremembered 2947 into the standby altimeter, he still put the correctly remembered, albeit still outdated, altimeter setting of 2923 into their main altimeter to account for the airport elevation. This discordance between the two altimeters should not have been a problem. As part of their checklist, during the approach, the pilots were due to confirm that the difference between the altitude on their main altimeters and the one displaying on their standby altimeter is equal to the airport elevation above sea level. So, at least for the moment, this was not an issue. The atmospheric pressure was still falling rapidly by the time the pilots were on their final approach. The true atmospheric pressure will have fallen to just 29.24 in of mercury, leading to their altimeters displaying an altitude which was over 40ft higher than their actual altitude. As you can see from this graph, the pilot's altimeter settings were now wrong. The actual air pressure was lower than the one that air traffic control had available to them, which was lower still than the one that the pilots were using on board. As they continued their descent, the pilots began briefing the approach for runway 15 at Bradley. This is a replica of the approach chart they employed. The first officer corroborated the captain's observation that the airport was located 174 feet above sea level. The pilots were unaware, though, that the height difference between the primary and standby altimeters was 240 feet, rather than the 174 feet of the airport. This happened as a result of the first officer using the standby altimeter with the wrong pressure setting, 2947, instead of the 2940 that the controller had given him. The pilots would have had a chance to inquire about the most recent Bradley pressure setting with air traffic control had they noticed this disparity. But they never took this action. The flight was now nearing the airport, and at 12:45 the first officer contacted approach control, who cleared them to descend to 4,000 ft. The controller provided the pilots with the current wind speed and direction. The wind was coming from 170 degrees at a speed of 29 knots, gusting to 39 knots. The cockpit voice recorder recorded the pilots laughing upon hearing this, with the first officer saying, "Well, you've got enough gas to go back." What? The direction of this wind was fine, almost straight down the runway. It was strong and gusting to 39 knots, which is over 70 km/h. The winds were so strong, in fact, that the windows in the control tower had started flexing and letting in rainwater. As a result of this, the tower had to be evacuated without a tower controller to give the aircraft a landing clearance. The approach controller would be the last controller to officially speak to the aircraft. In addition to providing the wind information, the controller should have provided the atmospheric pressure when the pilots initially made contact with him. Not only was this required by regulations, but it would have been prudent given how quickly the pressure was falling. Still, he just failed to mention this information. The most recent air pressure reading he could find was 29.38 at this point. It would soon decrease to 29.36. The pilots could have readjusted their altimeters and decreased their apparent height by 60 feet if he had provided them this information. Stated differently, the pilots were mistakenly 60 feet lower than they believed they were due to a controller error. This will prove to be significant in this regard, as we shall see. After that, the controller gave the crew the all-clear to approach runway 15. The airport is around 15 miles away. At 3,500 feet, the crew was aligned with the runway. The weather radar is a small antenna that is located, and the captain activated it in the nose of the aircraft. It swept out a cone-shaped piece of sky in front of the aircraft. He observed that there were no thunderstorms ahead, so he turned off the radar. He was using the autopilot to fly the aircraft at this point using the VO or localizer mode, in which the autopilot tries to direct the aircraft with reference to radio beacons on the ground. However, due to the strong winds, the autopilot was unable to keep the aircraft on course. At this point, the captain changed the autopilot to the heading select mode and turned the dial to manually direct the aircraft back to a heading where it could fly towards the runway. The pilots are now fully set up the aircraft for landing. The landing gear was secured in place and the flaps were lowered to a 40-degree angle. After that, the captain started descending to 2,000 feet, following the approach chart. Rain was pelting the windscreens and the aircraft was being thrown around by the severe winds. Now, the 73 passengers were looking forward to landing again. Their landing was less than 5 minutes away. The pilots were then informed by the approach controller that someone was now in the tower and that although it was, quote, not truly open, the crew may tune in to the tower frequency and communicate with them. The pilots then turned their radios to the terror frequency. The person in the tower was a supervisor who hadn't manned the tower position in 3 years. He had stayed back to ensure that the flight made it in safely. As he wasn't officially a tower controller, he couldn't legally clear the plane to land. The captain would have to land the plane entirely under his own authority. The plane had now reached 2,000 ft, and the autopilot kept it at that altitude. Once the crew had passed the 5-mile point from the runway, the captain began his descent to the minimum descent altitude of 908 ft above airport elevation. Minimum descent altitude is the lowest altitude that pilots are permitted to descend to during an approach without having sight of the runway. It differs from airport to airport depending on the presence of hills, buildings, and other obstacles in the vicinity. It is imperative that you remain above the minimum descent altitude, or MDA, as this ensures that you will never encounter one of these obstructions when you are getting close to an airport. Regarding Bradley Airport, there was a slope that rose to a height of 819 feet, around 2.5 miles from the runway threshold. But this hill was not shown on the pilot's approach charts. Instead, they only added a single point designating an obstruction that is 819 feet high. This was the only potentially perilous point of the approach, since it might easily be confused for an aerial atop a hill or some other isolated location. On the other hand, these color maps, which show the entirety of the surrounding terrain, were provided to British Airways pilots. If the American 1572 pilots had used these charts, they may have used this strategy in a slightly different way. The aircraft descended at a speed of 1,000 feet per minute thanks to the captain's usage of the autopilot's vertical speed mode. When he got there, the idea was for him to hit the altitude hold button and hold his altitude at 908 feet until he could see the runway. Since the team was only about to reach 10,000 feet, add 5 minutes to the first. Using the radio, the tower supervisor informed the pilots of a wind shear alert. Wind shear is a dangerous phenomenon which involves a rapidly changing wind direction over a short distance. The pilots had to be even more vigilant. From this point, if they encountered wind shear on final approach, they would have to go around immediately. American Airlines procedures required the pilot not flying, which in this case was the first officer to call out 3 altitudes during an approach. The first of these was when the aircraft was 1,000 feet above the airport elevation. Then, when it was 100 feet above the minimum descent altitude, and finally when the aircraft had reached the minimum descent altitude. As the aircraft reached 1,000 feet, the first officer of Flight 1572 called this out. But he did not call out 100 feet above the MDA. He did, however, remind the captain, as he neared 2,000 feet, that 900 waft was the MBDA, which served a similar purpose. At this point, the first officer was looking through the windshield trying to locate the airport through the rain. When he looked back again at his instruments, he noticed that the aircraft had now slipped below the minimum altitude. He said to the captain, "You're going below your..." In reaction to this, the autopilot's altitude hold button was pressed by the captain. Right now. The airplane was falling too quickly toward the ground below, so the covert alarms in the cockpit went off. After 4 seconds, the aircraft broke through trees on the hilltop at a speed of about 250 km/h. There was a loud noise in the cabin and the plane trembled badly. The engines started to flame out after ingesting branches. The airplane was still 2.5 miles from the runway. "Continue on. We're moving around in circles. circling the area. The captain lifts the flaps to a 15-degree angle and engages the throttles to their utmost capacity in order to get the gear up. Yep. The plane's airspeed was now decreasing and it began to fall towards the ground. Life mode has failed. There's the runway straight ahead. Okay. Tell them we're going down. Tell them emergency tower, call for emergency equipment. We have. We're going down in the on my. You want to go back down? Yes. Throw down. Think. Oh God. You're going to make it okay? Don't think. Flaps. Put him down. The captain asked the first officer to lower the flaps fully. This was a risky decision. He was hoping that even though this would reduce his airspeed, he would be able to gain a bit of extra lift which would slow his descent and extend his glide. What do we got? We're still flying. Okay. Oh. Thank God. Keep going. You're going to make it. Keep going. Win. 170. 2-2. All right. All right. Yeah. Call for emergency. Call for emergency equipment. They're coming. They're coming. All right. You got it, dude. You're going to make it. Okay. Flaps 40 all the way down. All the way up to 40. They're all the way. Okay, hold on, guy. The aircraft clipped the top of a tree near the end of the runway and then smashed through the ILS antenna array before hitting the ground hard on the edge of the subway. Get it on the deck. Hold it down, buddy. Hold it down, hold it down, hold it down, hold it down. Amazingly, the pilot had landed his downed aircraft without seriously injuring a single person within. He gave the first officer the order to turn off the engines and pull the fire handles, which doused the engines with fire retardant and put out any remaining flames. Then he gave the order to evacuate the aircraft. Except for one who sustained minor bruises, every passenger and member of the crew had escaped unharmed. The combat crew's failure to maintain the minimum fall altitude during the approach was found to be the principal cause of the crash by National Transportation Safety Board investigators. As the jet dropped toward the MDA, the first officer should never have been peering out the windscreen toward the runway. His job was to carefully watch the instruments as the captain flew the aircraft, and to tell the captain when the minimum descent altitude was reached. If he had done this, and if the captain had kept the aircraft at the minimum descent altitude, they would never have struck the trees, even when the altimeter is set incorrectly. However, the flight crew's neglect to request the most recent altimeter setting during the approach was also mentioned in the final report as a contributing factor. Had they had the latest setting of 29.38 inches of mercury, they probably would not have affected the trees. Another contributing factor to this disaster, according to the investigation, was the controller's failure to provide them the updated setting. The captain was informed by the first officer that he had descended below the minimum descent altitude, MDA, but the NTSB questioned his choice to activate the altitude hold button. He ought to have taken over the aircraft's controls from the autopilot at this point and ascended it back to the minimum descent height altitude. Pressing the altitude home button meant that the plane continued to round out its descent before stabilizing at an altitude which was still below the MDA. This was an incredibly close call. If the altimeter setting had been any more out of date than it was, or if the pilots had continued their descent for any longer, the aircraft would likely have struck the ridge itself rather than the trees on top of it, leading to a massive loss of life. The final report commends the crew for their actions from the moment the aircraft hit the woods, notwithstanding how scathing it is about their inability to notice and react effectively to the descent below the minimum descent altitude. This is an exact passage from the completed report. The flight crew's actions following the first tree collision were remarkable, even though they dipped below the MDA. The airplane's leading edge on the trailing edge flap sustained significant damage. Following the tree strike, one engine's power almost immediately failed, while the second engine's power collapsed soon after. The aircraft would have likely landed in inappropriate terrain before the clear area at the end of the runway, if the captain and first officer had made any errors in glide path management, ground track management, or airplane configuration timing. This would have definitely led to more serious injuries for the crew and passengers. The safety board determines that the flight crew's exceptional performance, resource management, and flying abilities, as evidenced by the voice recorder in the cockpit after the collision with the trees, were directly accountable for keeping the number of injured passengers to a single person. However, the airplane sustained $9 million in damage. After being fixed, It kept flying until 2017, when American Airlines decided to withdraw aircraft from operation. You can tap on the links here on the screen to support the channel's growth and to receive wonderful benefits like first access to new content. I want to express my gratitude to Joey and Maxwell in particular for their kind contributions. By utilizing the link in the description to get a cheap Blinkist membership, you can also help the channel. With any luck, you liked this video. Once again, I appreciate your time and I hope to see you in the next episode.